What's up, guys? Welcome back to another Q&A. It is December 18th, 2019. We did a open Q&A this week. And let's take a look at the questions. All right. How do you set up your off-day nutrition, and when would you recommend a deload? Signs and symptoms, how to set one up. Well, I think there was another question about my off-day nutrition on here too, so I might hit this one twice. But generally, I rotate my carbohydrates down and I rotate my fats up. Now, my calories are lower on non-training days, so I'm not simply taking the carbs out and replacing all the calories with fat, but I am replacing some of them with fat. My non-training days right now are probably, at least based on what I've seen, closer to caloric maintenance, right around, give or take a little bit. And then my training days are above. So I'm in a surplus most of the time, or baseline or surplus most of the time, but these days do help at least maintain insulin sensitivity a little bit better for me. Now, this isn't going to be the same across the board, because there are people that will, if they run higher fat diets, they might see increases in blood sugar, and this could be simply because they don't digest fats well. Gastric emptying is really slow. They kind of just build up as the day goes on, and their sugars are going to go up and up and up and up. And I even have people that they'll eat high fat diet and they'll wake up with high sugars the next day after everything's digested. So fats, high fat diets, especially in the presence of a caloric surplus, can still cause insulin resistance and higher blood sugars. So keep that in mind. It's not necessarily going to be the setup that works for everyone. It does work well for me. I tend to digest them well. So that's why I do it. And it also is a lot less food volume. Fats are more calorically dense, and it's not less volume of food that I have to put in my stomach as well. So it does help my GI tract in that regard. And let's see, deloads. Actually, for the deloads, I would just honestly suggest listening to the Mind Body broadcast episode that we did on deloads called All About. I have my list of episodes pulled up here, I think. Let's see. All About Deloading. Exactly what it's called. Episode 49. So I would check that out, because that's kind of it is definitely an in-depth subject, and it's not going to be the same across the board in terms of how someone might do it, when they might do it, why they might do it, should they do it at all, and so on and so forth. So I would check that out for sure. But the off-day nutrition too, just to kind of touch on that again, make sure I'm more specific. The macros on those days are, off the top of my head, I believe it's 385 protein, about 200 grams of carbs, and it is 230 fat, I think, right now. It could be off by, I'd have to look at my chart. It could be off by a little bit, but it's right around that. Whereas my training days are 375 protein, 1050 carb, and 100 grams of fat. So calories are super, super high, but you can see how calories do rotate down and the fats rotate up quite a bit on those non-training days. Off-season cardio, how much of an impact has it on minimizing fat gain when a caloric surplus? Very little, to be honest. It can help with insulin sensitivity. Sometimes I'll include bouts of it at times with people that have harder time controlling blood sugars and get insulin resistant quicker. We'll include it at times. Maybe not all the time. Maybe some weeks I'll tell them to put it in. Some weeks I'll tell them to take it out. Maybe it's, short to moderate sessions. But maybe also have people do it that have just really poor cardiovascular endurance, and their training really suffers because they're just huffing and puffing. They might need to do it. So there's a few reasons, but in terms of actually minimizing fat gain, it's not going to have a whole lot of impact on it. in the grand scheme of things, because if you're controlling the caloric surplus and that caloric surplus isn't too big, then that's going to be the main thing at the end of the day. And then, like I said, you might use it as a tool occasionally to help maintain that insulin sensitivity. It can help with that. Sorry guys, cat's bugging me. Let's see. Scroll on down. Maybe all the ones on that list. Okay, move over here. All right, next one is, what do you recommend for gut health? Well, that's super broad, and I would need to know, like, is this person symptomatic of anything? What are they trying to accomplish here? Because in reality, you might not need anything at all. There's not necessarily universal supplements that I'm going to suggest to everyone. I mean, I have people that don't use anything for gut health because food selection's good, stress levels are controlled, they're not symptomatic of anything, they just don't need anything. You know what I mean? So I'm not necessarily going to just haphazardly throw things into the supplementation. But if they're symptomatic of something and we need to address it, then we will. But that's kind of a difficult question to answer. But what I can say is, you want to make sure that first and foremost that food selection is proper for you. Most gut issues, outside of some minimal supplementation or outside of people that have like inflammatory bowel issues or disorders, or people that have inherited some kind of bacterial issue like E. coli or SIBO, or SIBO is kind of broad, but C. diff, there's several. You really shouldn't need a lot to control gut health. It really comes down to stress management, good eating habits, things like chewing your food properly, not drinking tons and tons of fluid with meals, not dilute digestive acids too much, making sure that you're calm before you eat, making sure that you're eating a meal frequency that works well for you. Your meals aren't just overlapping a ton during the day if you're eating super high meal frequency. Implementing things like fasting here and there if you need to. Food selection, like I said, is crucial. So, all of those things are really going to be first and foremost. And then supplementation just really is based around need and if the person's symptomatic. So I can't really recommend anything without knowing that. But I can't say, I can't give those general recommendations in terms of things you can do lifestyle-wise. Ways to increase appetite other than a pullback phase. Well, I mentioned a couple of them in that last question. So I think meal frequency is honestly a big one. I've noticed for me and with some clients, like especially when they're eating a lot of food, that higher meal frequency really doesn't do well for them. And the reason I find is because the meals just overlap. Now, obviously, if we go lower meal frequency, that's going to mean the meals are bigger, right? However, I have found that it does seem to work better to have slightly larger meals less frequently and actually allow them to digest fully before eating again, and they have a little bit of hunger, before the next meal. And that can also even give you a little bit of time to like maybe fast in the mornings a little bit, perhaps. So I would say lower meal frequency, and then second to that, or maybe tied in importance to that, would be food selection. So with high food, you have to be creative with food selection. You have to use things that are going to digest well. You can't just expect to eat, 5,000-6,000 calories from rice, potatoes, and chicken. People do it, but there's better ways to do it. You can add things into the meals to help lower food volume, or even, more calorically dense foods. And it can be processed foods, right? But it can also be things like, we talked about this on a podcast today, things like adding bits of fresh fruit juice to meals, using things like dried fruits. They're dehydrated, right? Not a lot of water content, super calorically dense, nice carb source. Have a lot of antioxidants, micronutrients, fiber, blah, blah, blah. It's all that stuff, right? So you can do that, and trying to cut down on food volume, cut down on meal frequency, use foods that digest well, use foods that minimize total food volume, and use fasting periodically if needed. Also, controlling blood sugar is a big one. Typically, people that control blood sugar and have good insulin sensitivity are going to have better hunger. That's why some people will say, insulin is kind of like a digestive aid. Well, not really, but it does help partition things and help clear out nutrients and get you ready to receive nutrients again. So other ways, supplementation wise, like high food intake, increasing digestive acids, like taking something like D-limonene to help with bile flow and with your bile ducts to help digest. That's like a good practice. Also using beta-NHCl to help increase stomach acids. That's another good way to definitely digest higher amounts of food. I use that religiously right now with high food intake. I'm doing like 4 to 5 per meal, depending on the day. So it's a pretty high amount, and that helps a lot. You can definitely notice the difference between taking it and not taking it. And with that, a lot of time I'll start with 1 to 2 caps per meal and then have someone assess, are they hungry, getting hungrier sooner? Do they feel like they're digesting quicker and ready to receive food sooner, or not? Do we need more? And then, So, those are some things that you can do outside of like artificially increasing it with different drugs and things, which I don't really recommend because, it's artificial and you're just asking for issues with your GI tract, because your GI tract is going to tell you if it's ready to receive food or not. So if you're super stuffed and you're trying to stuff in more food, if you artificially increase it with some kind of, pharmaceutical, it's not going to do your GI tract any favors. So that's not going to get you very far for very long. All right. My question is about you. What's the reason for your macronutrient breakdown on your off days? Why so many fats? All right. Well, I kind of answered that in previous question, but I do well with that. It does help control my sugars. My blood sugar typically comes down on those days with lower carbs, even though, like I said, some people will do poorly on a high fat diet, and we'll see blood sugar increases and insulin resistance and a caloric surplus. That's not me. I digest them well. I do well on them. I'm someone that could do well on a ketogenic diet if I needed to. So that's part of the reason. Also, rotating nutrients and just some semblance of metabolic flexibility, having different nutrients in the diet, or macronutrients in the diet. Also, flavor. It's good to rotate, like have different flavors in your diet. And it also gives you a variety of micronutrients when you can have like kind of a drastic rotation like that. I'm not just eating chicken and rice every single meal. It gives me some different rotations of dietary nutrients as well. So those are some of the reasons. And like I said, it works for me body composition wise, and it works for me in terms of insulin sensitivity. It's not going to work for everyone. I have people that, like I said, clients that I wouldn't use that with. And then I have others that work that, it works well with. So, take that with a grain of salt. Just got a couple more here. Looks like good rule of thumb or good rule or metric for increasing load each week. Also, if you don't hit a PR on your top set, do you shoot for beating your max reps or wait on the back down set? Thanks. So I'm assuming this person's using kind of like a top set approach and followed by a back down set. So it sounds like. Well, we talked about this on podcast today too, this off-season podcast that we did. I would definitely suggest checking that out when it comes out. But this is a tough one because I think by nature we want to hit these huge PRs all the time. And I don't necessarily think that's the best way to go about progression. Sometimes, I don't want to say being reserved because I think that's not really a good word choice, but I would say being strategic in your progression is going to allow you to progress week to week and not always trying to get greedy and nail those huge PRs. Instead of a 30, 40 pound PR, you might only hit a 5 or 10. But if you can hit a 5 or 10 every week mentally, that's also more satisfying that you're continually progressing. You're not going to have those down weeks where you're not doing anything. You can progress more often. You're probably also at slightly less risk for any kind of tweaking, muscles or injuries, so on and so forth. So because you're increasing loads a little bit slower and allowing connective tissue to also kind of keep up. So I'm not going to say that I always go for these super small, increments, but like today, for example, I did squats and I was one rep above my last week. I probably could have got kind of sloppy execution and kind of buried the second one, but I clicked it off in my head. I barely got that +1 up, and instead of trying to drop down and just have this next really ugly one, I just racked it and go again next week. However, if you're looking for a set scheme in terms of this is how much weight you should increase each time, there isn't one. I mean, there's not really anything to tell you because everyone feels different when they warm up too. Some people, it feels terrible as they warm up. Man, this weight's really heavy. There's no way I'm gonna get a PR, and they do it. So sometimes it's very much mental, and you have to have a number in your head, and you have to really have this goal in mind, and you have to shoot high, and you have to get under that bar or grab that bar and excuse me, and know that you can do it or believe that you can do it. So get under there and do it. But I tend to steer toward the more reasonable increments instead of the huge increments. If you're having a really good day, maybe go slightly bigger, but don't get real greedy. Even though you're feeling like Superman, you don't necessarily need to put 60, 70 pounds more on your squat that day, right? I hope that sheds a little bit of insight. As far as hitting, if you don't hit a top set PR, do you shoot for beating your max reps or weight on back down set? Yeah, you can, for sure. If that's the scheme that you're doing, you definitely can, because you got to think you're still accumulating more volume, or you're still progressively overloading. And that's another thing we talked about today is you don't necessarily have to PRs in any rep range is still a PR. If you did 6 reps at 400 pounds and then you tied your 600, 6 times 400 from last week, but on your back down you did +2 over last week, that's still progressive overload. You know what I mean? So that's progress still. So yeah, kind of just nickel and dime it where you can, for sure. It's not always going to be on every exercise, and it's not always going to be on the sets that you necessarily think it's going to be on either. So yeah, I would definitely say that that's a good rule of thumb. I think I have one more. Should be my last one. I feel like I'm missing one here. Okay, yep. What are your thoughts on high carb, low fat massing to prevent excessive fat accrual in the off season? Also, what would be the lowest you'd set a client's fat at during this period? Well, yeah, this kind of ties into the macro rotation type questions that I did a little bit ago. I think it's fine. Like, honestly, I mean, like, I have people that, even if we're rotating calories down, like we take away carbs a little bit on non-training days, or, or when activity's lower, we don't even necessarily add fats back in. Sometimes I'll just reduce the carbs a little bit and go on with it, and that'll be it. We'll just kind of have like a high carb and a slightly less carb, or even do 3-way rotations with some people, depending on their energy needs and what they're training certain days, and weak body parts and what have you. Might even do like a 3-way rotation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm like messing with fats in there. We might just leave fats low the whole time. If they are, there's someone that metabolizes glucose well and they feel good on it, that's what we're going to do. I mean, that's fine. I'm not really dead set on any specific rotation. It's really based on the individual, and things like I said, like monitoring, like the monitoring blood glucose can be good, because then you can see like how are they digesting nutrients, what is it doing to their insulin sensitivity, / partitioning, and whatever's better for those things is typically going to be better for body composition on the long run. Even if it's just a matter of them maintaining insulin sensitivity longer, that just means they're not going to get fat as quick and they can grow longer. So yeah, I mean, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And there's, there are people that are like super hardcore advocates of doing low fat all the time and just tons of carbs. And that's okay. And it does work for some people. So, and typically I think people are going to know if they're that type of person that is a very good carb or glucose metabolizer, and they're probably going to kind of know if they're that person, and they'll be able to implement something like this. And then lowest fat you'd set a client at during this time period. Well, okay, so we know we need like some essential amount of fat, right? And for hormonal, hormone production and just general health and brain health and, all that good stuff. However, you're going to be a little less susceptible to any of these negative hormonal downregulation, during a caloric surplus. So it's a little less important. However, you still need fat for, certain types of fat can potentially have some cardiovascular benefits, can also have brain health benefits, benefits to your joints, and so on and so forth. I mean, there are really good fat sources that have lots of important nutrients in them. So I would keep that in mind. Minimum, I have people that are in like the 5, 6, 700 carb range that do like 50 grams or less, like 30, 40 grams. Even, around 30 is pretty low. I probably wouldn't go much lower than that. The tricky part there too is like using food sources that are going to have the protein and carbs, but not go over on your fats. And there's sources that do it. Like you can use like 99% turkey, chicken tenderloin, egg whites, whey isolate, white rice, potatoes, so on and so forth. But if you're eating tons of food and all you're eating is chicken tenderloin and rice, man, that's going to suck after a while. It's going to be really dry and shitty, and you might not want to do it for very long. So that's maybe a little bit of fat in there, so you can include a slightly juicier cut of meat or something just to make it a little more palatable. But I mean, even 50 grams is still like reasonably low for that type of low fat, high carb type of approach. So that's it, guys. All the questions for this week. Appreciate them, and we'll talk to you guys next time.